Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's ISDA webinar on the ISDA Amendment Agreement relating to the MAS risk mitigation requirements and the implementation of this agreement on ISDA Amend. My name is Rishi Kapoor at ISDA. It's only just gone 10 o'clock Singapore time, so we'll give people another 2 minutes or so to join the webinar, and then we'll make a start after that. Thank you very much. Once again, for those who have just joined us, welcome to today's webinar on the risk mitigation requirements and the implementation of the ISDA Amendment Agreement on ISDA Amend. We're going to give people another minute or so to join this webinar, after which we will make a start. So thank you for being on time. Once again, welcome to today's webinar relating to the MAS risk mitigation requirements and the ISDA Amend implementation of the ISDA Amendment Agreement. We'll give people another 30 seconds to join the webinar, and then we'll make a start after that. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Once again, let me welcome everyone to today's ISDA webinar on the ISDA Amendment Agreement relating to the MAS risk mitigation requirements and the implementation of this agreement on ISDA Amend. This webinar is being held in conjunction with Linklaters and IHS Markit. My name is Rishi Kapoor, Director of Public Policy for Asia Pacific at ISDA. I'm joined by my colleague Jing Gu, who heads up our legal for Asia at ISDA as well. And today's speakers for the webinar will be Sonia Lim, who's Counsel for Structured Finance at Linklaters Singapore, who will take us through an overview of the MAS risk mitigation requirements and the ISDA Amendment Agreement. Following her will be Mr. Ming Chung from IHS Markit Singapore, who will also take us through an overview and a live demo of the ISDA Amend platform. We don't expect this webinar to take up more than 30 minutes of your time at this stage. Just a few housekeeping matters at the top of the webinar. First of all, to ensure that you're following the webinar with us, please refer to the slide deck which we circulated yesterday in the ISDA memo for today's session. As well, you should currently see the screen saying MAS risk mitigation requirements on your webinar with mine and Sonia's names. Please be advised that there's no telephone dial-in for this webinar. And so to ensure that you can hear us clearly, please ensure that your computer volume is turned up. If you do have a question or any sort of technical issue, please type it into the Q&A chat box, and one of our staff will get back to you as soon as possible. Also, you can contact the speakers directly through the webinar, through that Q&A chat box, and our contact details will also be listed towards the end of the webinar as well on one of the slides. Lastly, I just want to advise everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and therefore to receive the on-demand version, please ensure that you've RSVP'd to ISDA using the details in our memo, and as well registered at the event lobby link, which was provided upon your RSVP. And it's important that you do register using that event lobby link, because that's how we'll send out the recording and the link to the on-demand webinar. We're expecting to do that tomorrow or shortly thereafter. That takes us through the housekeeping matters. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll now hand it over to Sonia to take us through the MAS risk mitigation requirements and the ISDA amendment agreement as well. Thank you. Sonia.
Okay, thanks, Rishi, and good morning to everyone. So to give a bit of background, the risk mitigation requirements is actually part of the G20 requirements. And if you look at what MAS has done, the requirements are actually specified in the Securities and Futures Regulations, License and Conduct of Business rules. Now, the requirements are fairly high-level, non-prescriptive. And in order to help market participants to implement the requirements, MAS has actually published certain guidelines, which you can find on the MAS website. So if you look at the effective date of implementation, we are looking at 8th of October this year, which gives us a few months to kind of like get things in order. Now, there are three types of entities that will be directly in scope for the risk mitigation requirements. So we're looking at licensed banks, licensed merchant banks, as well as finance companies. Now, in-scope entities have to comply with the risk mitigation requirements when they trade OTC derivatives with AIs, EIs, and IIs. So bear in mind that this is not just limited to institutional clients, so potentially it can actually affect private bank clients as well. Now, there are certain products that are in scope. In essence, we're looking at uncleared derivatives, and only to the extent that they are booked in Singapore. Now, turning to the next page, if you look at what the risk mitigation requirements are here in Singapore, it is fairly consistent with what we have seen at a global level. So at a high level, the requirements are that in-scope entities will be required to implement policies and procedures to address 5 key things. Number one, to ensure that trading relationship documents are in writing before trade execution. In-scope entities have to also ensure that trade confirmations are in place as soon as practicable after execution of trades. There's a requirement to ensure that material terms and valuations are reconciled, and there's also a requirement for in-scope entities to assess regularly when there's a need to do portfolio compression. And last but not least, there's a requirement for in-scope entities to agree on dispute resolution mechanism. So question is, how do in-scope entities comply with these requirements? Turning to the next page, I think one first thing to highlight is it is important to note that for the Singapore requirements, there's actually no substitute compliance. So which means that if there's an in-scope entity, if you are subject to, say, the EMIR requirements or the Hong Kong requirements, this does not immediately get you outside of the Singapore requirements. What in-scope entities will need to do, in essence, is to look at their policies, procedures, and assess whether or not they can comply with the Singapore requirements. And as part of this, I think one key important thing to note is that in most cases, there will be a requirement to enter into agreements with in-scope clients. Now, if you need more information on any of these specific requirements, we've attached a link on the recent client alert that we have published. Moving to the next page. So in order to help industry participants to comply with this requirement, ISDA has, as of last year, published the ISDA Amendment Agreement. Now, this is a fairly flexible document, and the main thing that this document seeks to achieve is to give participants the ability to amend documents to address the MAS requirements. And this document can actually be used, with respect to a large scope of covered agreements. So looking at the next page, we have basically set out some of the covered master agreements that can be used in conjunction with this document. So if you look at this list, you can use this in conjunction with an ISDA master agreement that has actually been executed. You can also use it in conjunction with a long-form confirmation where ISDA agreements have been deemed. And what it can also do is, to the extent that you have not entered into a master agreement or you do not have a long-form confirmation, there are also provisions to deem ISDA master agreement to apply, and you can then use this amendment agreement to amend those terms. Now, finally, I think it is also important to highlight that, other than ISDA-type agreements, there is also flexibility for market participants to designate any kind of other agreements to be used in conjunction with this ISDA agreement. So, for example, in the case of private bank clients, to the extent that you have mini-master agreement, this document can be used as well. Now, the one last thing that I would highlight is that in the course of using this master agreement, it is important to check if there's any third-party consent that may be required to be addressed, and that will need to be addressed accordingly in the document. Now, with that, let me just turn it over to Ming to discuss more about the ISDA amend process.
Hi, thank you, Sonia. Good morning, everyone. This is Ming from IHS Markit. So today, I'll just be walking you through our ISDA amend platform and how you can utilize this to really help you complete the MAS risk mitigation requirements agreement that we've digitized on the ISDA amend platform. So if we can go on to the next slide. So for those of you who are not too familiar, essentially ISDA Amend is a partnership between IHS Markit and ISDA, and we essentially provide a digital platform allowing market participants to exchange a lot of the regulatory requirements and paperwork that are included, including some of the major ones like Dodd-Frank and EMIR. This platform is built on Counterparty Manager, which is a platform that's been around for over 12 years now. And it's mostly free for any buy side to use. And what this tool enables is really covering the full spectrum of onboarding all the way to ready to trade. So it was with the purpose of being able to exchange onboarding KYC information, as well as tax documents, such as FACA forms, CRS forms, all the way through to include AML and credit requirements such as exchange in NABs and AUMs. But the sole purpose of this tool is really to allow you a secured online platform that you can digitize your information, centralize it in one single place, and more importantly, be able to repurpose that to multiple counterparties or trading relationships in a very efficient way. So if we move on to the next slide, just a little bit around how ISDA Amend, the platform, can help. This has been introduced in inception in 2012. Today, we have over 12,000 buy-side community using this platform, which equates to around over 200,000 legal entities and around 57,000 users globally using it, with many in APAC. But the main point with this is, as I mentioned, for anyone who is a buy side who is requiring to rep or make protocol representations or regulatory representations, it's free to sign up. You'll get a digital login onto the secure platform where you can fill in the required forms. It's a much more simplified process. Essentially, is the work with ourselves and the partners to help digitize it with smart logic, allowing a very simplified process in terms of completing the forms. And more importantly, after it's already digitized and completed, you can then make that applicable to multiple trading relationships in a single way, just via a permissioning module to all of those banks that are done. So no longer do you have this very intensive bilateral onerous process where you have to complete it multiple times and exchange a document with your trading counterparties each and every time. And you'll also have a single location that you can reference and have visibility over what has been shared with which counterparties. If you do come in with any problems, we have a 24/7 client services that can also help with walking you through any login issues, sign-up issues, and we'll be sharing the contact information either via email or via telephone at the end of this call as well as the website that you can find more information on. So if I move on to the next slide, just to give you some of the backgrounds for those that are not too familiar, essentially here are just a whole host of kind of regulations that we have worked with ISDA that are on the ISDA Amend module today. So you can see really the start of this process was really around Dodd-Frank and EMIR, and we've since expanded onto other, regulatory challenges that impact the industry, being EMIR, being cross-border reps, margin requirements, and more recently, a lot of the jurisdictional stays. So today we're going to talk more about MAS risk mitigation requirements, but just so you also know, we're also working with ISDA on the IVOL protocol that will be coming in the near future. So essentially, it's a one-stop shop allowing you a roadmap of more and more regulations that come about. But the main purpose, again, if I mention, if you're an existing user of the platform already or made reps, it allows you to repurpose and reuse a lot of the information because your structure is already set up, your regulatory reps or certain information such as address, domicile is already entered, it becomes extremely easy for you to complete. So if I can move on to the next slide, please. So now I'm going to walk through the MAS risk mitigation requirements. So this is now live as of last week. But essentially, what all users would do, if you're an existing user, you can log into the ISDA Amend portal, and you'll see under the drop-down a new MAS risk mitigation requirements option under the regulations. If you're a new user who wishes to sign up, as I mentioned, it's free to sign up, and we'll post a link at the end of this session as well. But all you need to do is go onto the ISDA Amend section and select MAS risk mitigation requirements as I've highlighted in the screen. So if I go on to the next slide, once you select the option, it will simply take you to the MAS dashboard. And we've made this quite simplistic. If you're an existing user, the great thing is you'll have all of your existing regulatory relationships already established. So if you need to complete this with anyone who you've exchanged regulatory reps for Dodd-Frank, EMIR, all of those relationships will be already pre-created here, and you simply need to just update your questionnaire information. If you wish to add new counterparts or relationships, you have an option on the right-hand side where you can see that add relationships to establish those new banks that you don't have on here today. You have a very comprehensive filter option that you can filter on the bank's names or your legal entities and complete that. So if we work on to the next step, the MAS risk mitigation process can be completed in 3 simple steps. We've essentially just allowed you to select your counterparties, to complete your own entities, as well as filling out the questionnaire, and I'll walk through that. So if I can go on to the next slide, please. So this is the paper version of the ISDA MAS amendment agreement letter that Linklaters and ISDA have created together, and we've simply just digitized this option. So Linklaters and ISDA have been working with partnership with ourselves to help digitize this structure, and I'll show you how the questionnaire would look. But essentially, all the optionalities are preserved within the digital version that I will be going on to the next one. So if I go on to the first step, next slide, please. The very first step is really simply selecting your entity that is applicable. So if you're an existing user, your entity will already be presented on the dashboard that you've created. If you're a new user, we usually capture that during the onboarding process for you. So you just need to simply select my entity that is applicable, and then simply just move on to the next step. So that takes you on to the second step, which is selecting all the counterparties or your trading relationships that you wish to move on to the next step. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see that you'll go and select my counterparty selections. So if I have multi-counterparties that I need to select, then I will be there. And then the final step, what you can see on screen right now, is really around completing the questionnaire. So it's a very straightforward process. The questionnaire is broken down into two main elements. One that we call the questionnaire that is applied to all counterparties on the generic level. And as you can see here, referencing back to the MAS requirements, you have the option. Sorry, if I can just go back one slide. On here, you can see you would have your simple selections of selecting whether you wish to nominate yourselves as a portfolio sending entity or a receiving entity. And again, we've used smart logic here with the help of Linklaters and ISDA. And essentially on here, there are rule engines that are put in place depending on your selection. Additional questions or applicable questions may arise as a result of that, but essentially giving you a very simple interface. As you can see here, you'll select if you agree to certain cutoffs or not, and then entering, the countries, the local business days, and so forth. And then as we move down on the sheet, is really around being able to fill in your affiliate information, your third-party information, and more importantly, down at the bottom, you've got information capture around your contact information surrounding portfolio data, dispute notices, and so forth. And as I mentioned, if you're an existing user of the tool, you'll have a library of your contacts that you may have used for other regulations in the past as well. So it'll be type sensitive. Everything can be reused at a very simple stage. And really, if we go on to the next part, the next part is really at a relationship level. So how we've designed this is essentially if you, by default, through a lot of design sessions, your questionnaire will be applicable to all the counterparty entities that you've selected. If you need to change any of the selections on a relationship basis, then you can make those amendments as you go back. But within here is extremely straightforward. So on a relationship level, you can see that you will be able to select the different parameters around, have you got any existing covered master agreements in play, or if you wish to deem an ISDA master agreement in here as well. One thing that is quite unique around this is we've been working with a number of banks on the design, and we've also incorporated the US stay rider within this tool as well. So at the very bottom, you'll be able to see that if you are deeming a master agreement against a U.S. bank or so forth, or a bank that falls within the U.S. state, then you also have the option to opt into the U.S. stay protocol at this point under yes and no. So if I go on to the final point, once you've filled out the questionnaire, you submit, and that's really it. And you can see the submit option will come out with the verbiage that you're about to submit the questionnaire. And it's really that simple. The final step, if I go on to the next slide, it's really around being able to look at the matching of you and your counterparty. So can I just move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, and one more. Okay, great. So this is the final process. So once you've submitted your questionnaire, establish your relationships, submitted all the information, then you have what we call the confirmation screen that you're able to see your questionnaire responses against your counterparties or your trading counterparties' responses as well. And you'll have the optionality to download this once everything is completed, as well as being able to update any of the contact information should you change at time. And as I mentioned, everything is in real time. So as soon as you change it, your bank or your private bank will be able to get this information instantly. So that's really all I wanted to show you. It's quite a straightforward process. And at the end, if I go on to the next slide, we have some contact information here. But if you're an existing user of ISDA Amend, you can go in under the MAS risk mitigation requirements and complete that straight away. Or if you are a new client that wishes to leverage this, you can sign up using the ISDA Amend link to sign up to Counterparty Manager and ISDA Amend. And essentially, we'll walk you through how to complete that through our client services team as well. So that's all that I have. We can open it up to any questions that we may have. And once again, any questions that you do have, please submit them in the Q&A section of the screen so we can help address those. Okay, so we have a first question really surrounding the different entities that are applicable. I'm not sure, Sonia or Rishi, if you would like to take this one. It's surrounding if they enter into an MAS amendment agreement with three banks, are they complied with the MAS requirements. I think from a documentation perspective, if you complete that, it helps set up the framework, but I'll let you address and fill in if there's any other requirements needed to be there.
Okay, hi, this is Sonia here. So I think to address the question, the MAS risk mitigation requirements applies to licensed banks, merchant banks, and finance companies. So I think that's the first question to ask yourself, whether you're in scope. Now, to the question as to whether the execution of this agreement per se means that you are in compliance, I would actually just say that this agreement would help you comply with some of the requirements, but not necessarily everything. Because if you look at the requirements, it actually says that in-scope entities need to implement policies and procedures to address the 5 key requirements. So one of it is, trading documentation. So some of the requirements may or may not necessarily be embedded in this agreement to the extent that it can't be addressed through documentation.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Sonia. Are there any other questions? If you do, please submit them now. We still have a couple of minutes. Okay, great. I don't think there's any further questions. Essentially, all our information will be provided at the end of this webinar. As Rishi mentioned, we'll also have this recorded and sent out for anyone. So if you have any other further questions or discussions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. If there's no further questions, then this could conclude our webinar. Okay, I don't think there's any